welcome back to the Rangeland Fall Forum for this year. Thanks so much for joining us. I think you got a gist of what is up this week, as we've had 2 great days of presentations. And I'm really looking forward to bringing it to conclusion here because as I was walking to work this morning, it was getting kind of cold and I've got my fall shirt on. I was thinking about how much I always appreciate fall as that time to just sit back and reflect, to ponder, to think about things. And the first days of this symposium have really given us a chance to kind of sit back and ponder. So I'm Karen Launchbaugh at the University of Idaho with the Rangeland Center. And I hope that you're into helping us just ponder and ruminate and think about some ideas. We've raised a lot about concerns and questions about drought. Although we all come from different spaces and drought affects us all differently, it's certainly something that is affecting all of us. I love it that we've heard from both people on the ground, ranchers, managers, practitioners, and we've heard from scientists, because I think the solutions on the range come from those 2 places. They come from science and solutions, which are not found without people on the ground. They come from experience and research. And I love that range is often said to be a science and an art, because it really takes that connection of those 2 things. And we've tried to highlight that in this year's Fall Forum, and we try to highlight that in everything the Rangeland Center does. And we've also really been fortunate to be joined by the McClure Center, who does research on policy, which is something we don't do in the center. So they're a great partner of ours. Also happy to partner with the Idaho Rangeland Conservation Partnership, because the IRCP brings people together to talk and communicate and solve problems together, mostly based on experience. So I think it's a good space to go. I'm also happy that yesterday we heard a lot about the challenges, and there were a couple of themes that were really brought to our attention. And I love it that they were brought in stories. We saw pictures of what was going on. We saw graphs, and we even had poetry. So who knows what today will bring. All right, so again, we were brought some great ideas and information yesterday, but there was a couple of themes that kept coming through, and that was that we need to be adaptable and flexible to survive. I love this quote by Darwin, who said that it is not the strongest species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It's the one that is most adaptable to change. So we've been talking about drought and the challenges of drought. Today, we're going to turn our attentions to that ability to survive, that resilience. So these speakers in today have been asked to give us some ideas about how do we become adaptable? How do we become flexible? How do we survive this? And I'm really excited that today we have a really well-qualified person who's going to moderate this dynamic panel that we have. I'd like to introduce and bring to the stage Carmen Willmore. Carmen, thank you for taking on this challenge. I looked at the speakers that you have, and they're all great, and there's lots of perspectives. But you are the county extension educator in Lincoln County. And one thing I know is that extension educators have the ability to multitask. They have the ability to take lots of different ideas and put them into a package and help us understand it. So thank you, Carmen. As a member of the Rangeland Center, we're happy to have you as an extension educator and a member of the University of Idaho Extension. Thank you for being here. And now good luck on helping us see what these panelists have to say about surviving drought and being adaptable. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I'm looking forward to this panel and working with our speakers and kind of just discussing their strategies and what they have done over the year and years previously to adapt in these drought situations, and kind of what's worked, maybe what hasn't worked. And hopefully we can have some discussion about that today. So our first speaker today is Mark Pratt. He is a rancher who manages cattle in range in the Snake River Valley of Southeast Idaho, with summer range in the Blackfoot River Mountains. Mark graduated from the University of Idaho, so go Vandals, and taught high school ag in Firth, another great qualification, being a high school ag teacher, in Firth, Idaho for 12 years, and then farm business management at Idaho State University for 4 years before returning full-time to the family ranch in 2003. He's a past student of holistic management and ranching for profit, and he's the current president-elect of the Idaho Cattle Association. So I want to welcome Mark as our first panelist today, and it looks like you'll be talking to us a little bit about livestock management and marketing, and kind of give us that cattleman's perspective of how to adapt to drought. So I'll let you take it over, Mark.
I appreciate the opportunity to at least share my philosophies. In the course of this presentation, I wanted to share 4 pieces of sage advice that I've gotten over the years and has helped make some of the decisions that we base our operation on. I said earlier this summer at the summer roundup in salmon that this drought was going to be an educational opportunity for us, and it certainly has done that. I watched Ken Burns's documentary about the Dust Bowl a while back for a second or third time. And one of the people on there said that they called them the next year people. And I think that fits those of us in agriculture, because we're of a mind that next year is going to be better. And in a drought, it's that next month will be better, or next week will be better. We keep watching the skies and hoping for rain to fall out of them. But while we are eternal optimists, we also need to be realists in the situation that we find ourselves. And I'll just run through where we found ourselves this year and our response to it. It isn't the response, but it's how we've dealt with it. In April, we were towards the end of our calving, and April warmed up nice. Looked like it was really going to be a fantastic spring, and then it turned around and went cold and stayed cold through the rest of April and most of May. We've used the rule of thumb that when the day and night temperatures equal 100, it's safe to turn out, but that has to be consistently that it adds to 100. And we had some of that early in April, and then it went back, and an average of 80 degrees daily does not grow grass. We got our cattle turned out 27th of May. Another one of those pieces where the grass was higher than the haystack. So that's where we headed. We knew we were a little bit early, but we had a rotation ahead of us that we were relatively confident that the grass would get a chance, and we'd be leaving these fields behind to let them recover or make an attempt at it. The first field we went into usually lasted 7 to 10 days, and we stayed there for 5. And that trend continued through the month of June. 4 years ago, we made a change on our season of use. And so now we're using, during the middle of the summer, what used to be our fall field, which leaves an opportunity for our what used to be all of our summer to recover. So we left that field, we left that area at the end of June and went over to that 5 pasture rotation that we use in the middle of the summer now. And when we got there, it was apparent that we were in a different grass growth than normal. And we cut 50 pairs off along with our older bulls. But we figured we had plenty of bull power since probably 80% of the cows were already bred, and took some of the pressure off of the fields that we'd be going into. We did that at the end of June. I'm reminded of a David Rockefeller interview that I watched years ago, and they asked him what he credited their financial fortunes to, and he said, "We always sold too early." And I think that's the key. And what we're up against right now is it's hard to pull the plug. It's a gut-wrenching decision to make, and we don't know whether or not it's the right decision when we make it. And it's months or maybe a year before we know whether or not we've made the right decision. But selling early, we felt like we had a market that would give us the best return on the cows. We took those pairs home and weaned the calves off them. The calves are still on grass here in the valley, have been all summer, and the cows left the last week of June. That gave us 5 more days of grazing during that summer session. And as we were getting ready to leave there, we could see that regrowth in the area that we'd left was not near what it should be or could have been. There was some. We thought we'd probably need to wean about the middle of September, and it rained the last week of June and the first week of August, gave us a couple inches of rain up there. So that gave us 2 more weeks with the calves on the cows. And we weaned those calves the 25th of September. We've been using nose flaps, and so hauled those calves home on the 29th, took the flaps back out and put them back on grass, and we end up with a dry cow. By doing this, we reduce the water requirements of the whole herd, and we give those young cows a chance to get back into better body condition before we get into winter. Now, one of the Rockefeller quote was my first piece of sage advice. The second one was one my granddad would say: you can't starve a profit out of a cow. And so giving those young cows an opportunity to get back into body condition scores that it's easier to feed them through the winter was the goal in getting those calves off. Next, for the first time in 25 years, we preg checked those cows, pregnancy tested the cows last week. In fact, this past Monday, so that we could get those cattle off that didn't have a calf in them. We haven't felt that it was profitable to preg check those cows and sell them in the lowest market, but this quite possibly could be the highest market. Talking to the buyers, we had to schedule that out 2 weeks in advance to be able to get those cows into a processing plant, and that's getting more difficult. One of the plants we talked to, the closest kill date that you could get is the first week of November, and the other one gave us, like I say, 2 weeks before we could get in there, and it's getting more difficult. And we're seeing, instead of 60-cent cows that we had in June, we're at mid-50s, and currently last week he bought cows at 46 cents in Burley. So we know the pressure is on the cow market. The other piece that we have to manage around also is the dairy industry, and they're having not a very good go of it at the moment, and those cows are going into the same kill plants that our cows are, and so there's that added pressure on those plants. One of the things that I looked at is what I keep hearing is, boy, what will these cows be worth when everybody sells all these cows? If we can just hang on, we'll make a bundle. My granddad would also say, it's not how much you can afford to make, it's how much you can afford to lose. So those decisions have to be made early to keep from spending those cows. There's just so many options gut-wrenching decisions that have to be made. It's extremely difficult. I think Jim Hagenbarth hit it on the head yesterday when he was talking about mental health. Mental health is going to be a struggle if this drought continues. And speaking of the drought continuing, I looked at the Drought Monitor for October 1st through December 31st, and it's a large swath of the United States that remains in drought. And it's more of it from Nebraska through Texas that has potential of entering into drought. So this is a huge volume of country and the vast majority of the cattle in the United States that are going to be in these conditions. If it was smaller and you could ship your cows somewhere else and find grass, it would be less imperative to make these decisions, but that's not where we find ourselves. We find ourselves in a huge drought, and the pressures are going to be on to make those decisions early enough that you can have an economic impact, with the realization that it's probably going to cost you $500 a head to feed these cows through the winter. She better be she better be doing something for you. So with that, I will say that's what I have to offer today.
That's great, Mark. I think your comments about, this is the first time in 25 years you've thought it was worth it to do the preg check. That's not the first time I've heard that in the past few months. So I think that's a good management tool that, we can bring in years like this, so that whatever we're keeping at the home place, we make sure that they're going to be giving us something the next year, right?
You bet.
Yeah. Okay. Together. So our second speaker is Michael Courtney. He graduated with a degree in Rangeland Resource Management from the University of Idaho and began his career as a Rangeland Management Specialist and Wild Horse and Burro Specialist in Salmon, Idaho for the Bureau of Land Management, has worked in several field offices in Idaho. In 2015, he was named the Twin Falls District Manager, where he oversees 3 field offices in rangelands that cover more than 4 million acres, including the Craters of the Moon National Monument. Mike is widely respected for his collaborative management style and serves on the Partners Advisory Council for the U of I Rangeland Center. And today he will be talking to us a little bit about grass banks and rest pastures, and kind of just, more of these strategies for survival that we're going to be needing in the years to come.
Okay, thanks, Carmen. Good afternoon. My name's Mike Courtney. I'm the Twin Falls District Manager and feel fortunate to be a career Idaho BLM employee. I was asked today to talk about a number of things that BLM can do to help permittees survive drought. And the first thing I thought I would mention is a little known luxury that we have in Idaho BLM, and that is forage reserves. So next slide, please. The Dale Pierce allotment allows for a flexible season of use and livestock numbers. The water system's not conducive to winter use, so the majority of grazing that occurs on the Dale Pierce Forage Reserve is usually April through November. Cattle or sheep are authorized to run through a 4-pasture deferred rotation grazing system, and there's approximately 1,200 AUMs available there. The Burley Field Office does all the infrastructure maintenance, so they charge a $2 per AUM maintenance fee to the permittees that are selected to use the Dale Pierce allotment. Next slide. The allotment's managed in a way to ensure forage is available for the next grazing season and that range conditions remain healthy. Livestock numbers and durations are flexible and determined annually based upon current and projected forage availability. Next slide. So how does it work? Applications are received for the forage reserve each winter and spring, and the Burley Field Office range staff go through them and make a recommendation to the field manager for who they think should use it. There's a preference given to Twin Falls District permittees, but we have had off-district permittees use it in the recent past. The allotment receives grazing use nearly every grazing season, and as Dale Pierce intended when he gave up his permit to establish the forage reserve, it provides relief for fuels treatments, post-fire use, and drought. Idaho Falls District also has a forage reserve, and theirs is more recent. Idaho Falls, the Upper Snake Field Office in particular, worked with 14 big desert sheep permittees to carve out the 5,300 acre county line forage reserve. It has a well, a storage tank, a pipeline, a corral, and a fenced boundary. And this particular area is primarily a crested wheatgrass seeding. And like the Dale Pierce allotment, it's grazed usually April through December. And also like the Dale Pierce allotment, the Upper Snake permittees have a priority for use here. So there were some legal challenges that we had to get past when we established the county line forage reserve, but we prevailed. And since that time, it's been in use every year. So approximately 1,300 AUMs are authorized annually, and they charge $1 extra per AUM to do maintenance in this forage reserve. There are other things we can do to help alleviate the effects of drought. You know, there's no secret that when you have less forage, you go through your grazing system faster. But we can, and we do at times, authorize the use of rest pastures. It usually involves a serious discussion with the permittee about what that could mean for next grazing year. But most permittees are optimists and willing to take that risk. That fits right in with Mark's next year people comment. I appreciated that one. It's also fairly common for permittees to have non-use for a variety of reasons, such as their numbers are down, or in recent time, it's pretty common to have non-working ranches that have grazing permits attached to them. We can authorize another permittee to use that approved non-use. Usually involves an agreement though between the permittees. In places in the Twin Falls district this year, the water ran out long before the forage, and we do authorize temporary water hauls as a solution when that circumstance exists. Usually we have resource objectives for those areas, and when we meet them, then the water hauling site is moved to a different place. So in closing here, I think it's important to remember that drought affects everything on the landscape. You know, the plants they're adapted to it if we don't overuse them, but there are other critters out there too that we got to look out for. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Mike. I guess one question, and maybe Mark can chime in on this too, with this next year people concept that we kind of have a theme going here. You know, what could the next year look like? You know, what do you think? How do you think that we will make it in the next year?
Go ahead, Mark, and then I'll follow.
Okay. Well, as I looked at it, and I figured out, I was ciphering on animal days per acre reduction with the continuing drought. And if we have a 20% reduction in precip or greater, or 20% reduction in forage, we better be thinking about a 20% reduction in our livestock numbers. And how are we going to do that? But starving a profit into a cow can't be done. And we've got to figure out how to get through the next growing season. I think we've made it through this one relatively unscathed, but as we go into the next one, it's going to get extremely difficult. And to make it long run, I think you're going to have to be reacting sooner rather than later.
You know, and I would add, in BLM Idaho, we look at our relationship with the permittees as a partnership. And I think it's extremely important that you know, we're out on the ground, looking at things and making a plan that may be different than how we normally graze, but it's important that we're talking to get through these droughty times.
Right. Yeah. So I do have one question for Mike. What has been your experience for permittees with BLM and forest permits to graze flexible dates outside of the permitted dates?
So as a general rule in Idaho BLM, I can't speak to the forest because I'm not a Forest Service employee, but we're starting to write permits that have a flexible grazing season. So, you know, maybe we're advising permittees, don't apply for what you used to have, apply for the maximum dates you can graze on your allotment with maybe the maximum number of livestock you would ever have. So when these circumstances come up where you need some kind of flexibility somewhere, you have a permit that allows for that. And then as a general rule with the existing permits, we generally will go a couple weeks either side of the on and off dates if we need to.
Well, thank you, Mike, and Mark, for your input on that question. So I think we'll move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Lisa Jones. She is a research specialist in the Department of Plant Sciences at the University of Idaho, where she's worked for the past 5 years. She leads the Field Ecology Unit researching herbicide efficacy and plant community response in natural areas. She's knowledgeable about invasion biology and ecological impacts in grassland and shrub steppe systems of North and South Idaho. She has expertise in project management, vegetation monitoring, restoration, and GIS, which I think are all things that we're using a lot in the past years and in the future as well. So Lisa, I guess you'll be talking with us a little bit about invasive species management. So I'll let you take over.
Thanks, everyone. Today I'm going to provide you with an overview of how plants respond to drought and what we should consider when it comes to weed management. While there are many factors that make weeds successful, we can categorize some as inherent traits. So for example, high plasticity. This means that a plant is able to change its morphology and physiology in response to its environment. Weeds often also have broad environmental tolerances that they can succeed in a wide range of temperatures, precipitation regimes, etc. Many weeds also have high resource use efficiency. So this means a plant can generate more biomass for a given amount of nutrients consumed compared to another plant. And many are also able to opportunistically respond to environmental conditions. So this is something where you have a nutrient pulse, like a nitrogen flush or precipitation pulse, that a weed can take quicker advantage of that. Another explanation for weed success is called enemy release. And in this situation, the idea is that native plants are always stressed by enemies like pathogens and herbivores. However, non-native plants, because they came from another continent, they are not stressed by these enemies. So when you have drought occur, the weeds only have to contend with the stress of the drought, whereas the native plants, it's stacked on top of their already existing stressors. Now, we all know that drought is not a new phenomenon in our western rangelands, and our native plants are adapted to drought. What is new is the increased severity and duration. There's actually not that much published about how plants respond to drought. However, we know the timing of the drought is important. If we have a winter drought, some things that you can expect to see would be decreased germination, decreased seedling survival, perhaps increased seedling survival, which is a little counterintuitive, but the idea behind that is that moisture from either snow or rain is a good environment for fungal pathogens. So if you don't have that moisture, you can not have that pathogen, so the seedling would survive more. And also with winter drought, you expect to see decreased flower number. With a summer drought, what we often see is higher allocation of biomass to the below ground roots instead of the above ground shoots, because it's the plant searching for water. We see decreased seedling survival. We have decreased above ground biomass for seedlings and mature plants. However, there's generally high survival of established plants. Here I'm showing simplified data from an experiment measuring cheatgrass cover in response to 3 different climate scenarios. So we have cheatgrass cover on the y-axis and the 3 different climate regimes on the x-axis. And the authors looked at this in response to differing amounts of native grass cover. So in blue is no native grass, red is 20% cover of natives, and green is 50% cover of natives. So what we see in just the general ambient conditions, we have very high cheatgrass cover when there's no native grasses, and that really drops off as you increase the native grass cover. And then with our warming and drying situations, we see that cheatgrass cover also declines. So the authors concluded that the native grass community has a larger suppressive effect on cheatgrass than either drought or warmer temperatures. And this is supported by other research. And the point I'm trying to make here is that species response to drought does not exist in a vacuum. The neighboring plants have a strong impact on whether a population is increasing, decreasing, or stable. Now, herbicides are a common weed management tool, and their effectiveness must be considered based on the drought season. So if you have a winter drought, you expect to see decreased effectiveness of fall-applied pre-emergent herbicides, and this is because precipitation is required to move the herbicide down from the soil surface down to actually get in contact with the seed. With a summer drought, on the other hand, we see that herbicides are often less effective on stressed plants, and that's because the plants that are stressed can change some of their physiology so that they'll have a lower metabolic rate. They may develop a thicker cuticle on the leaf surface. They may have less leaf surface area to take in that herbicide. So in that situation, using a post-emergent herbicide in the spring when the plants are actively growing would be more effective. Now, there are some important limitations with how we apply our knowledge regarding drought and weeds. Our forecasting ability is imperfect, especially now with climate change. And we also have just minimal experience with long, frequent droughts. We are actually still learning about plant responses to drought. So management actions may need to get creative to combat effects of prolonged drought. For example, one technology is to use seed priming pellets. And what this is, basically you prime a seed, meaning you get it a little bit wet, and so the initial stages of germination occur, and then you dry it out, and then you put it in a pellet form with kind of a soil medium around it and plant that. And that's what the photo in the top right is showing. Circled in yellow are those primed pellets, so you can kind of see the pellet here and then the shoots of grass coming off. And then outside those pellets, there are also some seeds that were not primed and they have not germinated. So the advantage of using this technology is that you get more germination, earlier emergence, and better growth. So it's basically giving the plants a head start. And that is particularly beneficial for perennial grasses that may be competing with our winter annual grasses. Another idea is to use species for the future, so for warmer and drier conditions. So for example, until recently, blue bunch wheatgrass and Snake River wheatgrass were considered the same species, but now they're considered separate, and the Snake River wheatgrass is actually more tolerant to drought. So it would be preferential to seed that one at your lower elevation sites. Now, as a number of speakers have mentioned, drought impacts and subsequent management actions are not uniform in time and space. We need to consider the interacting effects of precipitation with temperature and site-specific characteristics like soil texture and plant community. What I have shown at the bottom here are some images of a spot in South Idaho from 3 years, a dry year, an average precipitation year, and a wet year. And some areas are more or less resilient to drought. So what I have circled in black is an area that is more resilient because across all three precipitation events, there's still some green. The green indicates more vegetation in that area. Whereas what's circled in red is an area that is less resilient to drought. In the dry year, there's not as much green, so not as much vegetation there, but when it's wet, it does green up. So there's also other management activities like grazing and vegetation management that a number of speakers have touched on that will influence your weed management actions. We should think about the effectiveness of management actions relative to whether you are entering or exiting a drought. So the graph on the left is actual annual precipitation values from a spot in South Idaho, and the dashed line across is the 30-year average. And what we notice is that generally wet years or wet times and dry times last more than 1 year. So while drought predictions are limited, it's likely that impacts from drought will last more than 1 year. So with this in mind, seeding would be best in the fall after you have a couple year drought if predictions are good for upcoming moisture like a La Nina year. Also, effectiveness of herbicides may vary depending on your application timing and herbicide traits like longevity and impacts to the native plants. So altogether, weed management is a challenge and it requires a thoughtful approach. Thank you, and I'll take some questions.
Yeah, so we did have one question came in. It was, how does crested wheat compare to the native plants in its survival in a drought?
I don't know the answer to that specifically. I think they're probably pretty comparable. A lot of it, you have to think about the rooting depth of comparing the rooting depth of those grasses. So our native perennial grasses are mostly very deep rooted, so that would allow them to have high survival.
Okay, great. I think we will move on to our next speaker just to keep with our time limit, but if we have any other questions, we'll bring them up at the end. So our next speaker is Brendan Brazee. He's with the Idaho State Rangeland Management Specialist with the Natural Resources Conservation Services and is responsible for providing training and technical assistance for planners, working with landowners and partners to develop conservation plans and grazing strategies. Brendan works closely with landowners to address resource concerns and landowner goals and objectives. He graduated from the University of Wyoming with a degree in range management and is an active member of the Society for Range Management. Brendan is widely recognized for his exceptional skill in plant identification and his understanding of plant response to grazing and climatic conditions. And that's pretty much what you're going to talk to us about today with the grass responses to grazing.
Thanks, Carmen. Well, this is kind of a fun topic. Grass response to grazing during drought. The true answer is one I learned from Karen a long time ago was it depends. It depends on the plant that you're looking at. It depends on the neighboring plants. It depends on the landscape around it. So I'm going to kind of get into some basic stuff and then kind of lead you down through into my kind of concluded, which is some of you guys already know, and some of you guys might give you something new to think about. So how does grass grow? Like all plants, grass needs solar energy, water, and nutrients. Each year, grass growth is initiated from a dormant basal bud when the temperature is around 40 degrees and adequate moisture is present. As the temperature warms up in late May and early June, rapid growth phases occur, which then prepare the plant for the reproductive phase and reproductive seed heads. And most of our cool season grasses here in Idaho seem to finish seed set and begin storing carbohydrates and root shedding as they prepare for summer dormancy kind of towards the middle of July. With cooler temperatures and fall precipitation, cross your fingers and hope so, root growth rapidly returns and next year's buds start to form. And if there is adequate moisture and the temperatures are good, then you'll get some regrowth on those tillers. So roots really are the key. Root growth occurs well beyond the defined growing season if soil moisture and temperatures are favorable and carbohydrates and nutrients are available. Roots begin growing early in the spring, long before you ever see any leaves coming up out of the ground. At this time, the root growth is entirely dependent on the stored carbohydrates. And now these are usually kept in the bottom 2 to 3 inches of the culms or the grass stems. Root growth often is suppressed during the periods of rapid growth just because of the energy demand of the plant. Photosynthesis is occurring, leaves are growing, and all of that energy is allocated to growth above ground. However, once we get back to that maturity stage, root growth begins to start again and accelerates as long as we have some leaves left to provide for photosynthesis. Root growth can continue into the fall and winter as long as conditions are favorable and resources exist. And roots are kind of a key component to annual production on rangelands, with below ground biomass sometimes as much as 3 to 4 times higher than above ground biomass in healthy plants. And this can account for 50 to 80% of annual production. On an average, perennial grass, for example, has to replace about 30% of its roots each year, and healthy root systems provide the resilience and the resistance for individual plants as well as the ecosystem they're part of. So how does grazing or drought impact the productivity and health of our systems? The take half, leave half grazing philosophy has a basis in fact. Has been determined that the effect on roots by the removal of leaf volume through grazing is negligible up to the point where about 50% of the leaf volume has been removed. After this, some serious damage can occur to the root system, even if one more bite is removed from that plant. The graph here on the right shows the change between 50% leaf volume removal and 60%. And you can see the difference between that 2 to 4 or the 50% stoppage in root growth. Now, does that mean that you can't graze it shorter than that? No, it's all about recovery and rest and the health of that plant overall. But if only the upper leaf blades of the tiller are removed, the effect is pretty minimal. And if you do remove any farther than that and get into the portion of the sheath of the tiller, you get into some of those stored carbohydrates and proteins that leaves less energy to support root maintenance and regrowth. Now, as we know, grasses evolved and adapted to use by grazing animals. That's why they are what they are. Multiple grazing events that occur before the plant is fully recovered results in that loss of that root biomass and reduces the area within the soil profile the plants have access to moisture and nutrients. And this, of course, can in turn lead to a reduction of above ground growth, reduce carbohydrate storage, and further limiting root production. Keep going, following the circle around, you can affect overall plant vigor and lead to reductions in range and soil health attributes. So how does it affect grasses? How does drought affect grasses? So as you can see here, grasses also evolved under drought conditions. And like the old RangeCon told me when I was first starting, we're always one rainstorm away from a drought. And as you can see, and Mark talked about it a little bit too, we're not off to a great start this year. It's looking a little better than it was, but not yet. And so there are a lot of different definitions of drought. And you can see that the different stages of drought get a little harsher all the time. So the meteorological drought, this drought is kind of defined as a period of substantially diminished precipitation, duration, and/or intensity. Agricultural droughts occurs when there's inadequate soil moisture to meet the needs of a particular crop at a particular time. The hydrological drought refers to deficiencies in surface and subsurface water supplies, and it's measured usually with stream flow, snowpack, lake reservoir, and groundwater storage levels. The final drought, which hopefully we don't get to, but some of our folks in the southern states, California, southern Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, these are guys are starting to end up with a socioeconomic drought. And this drought occurs when physical water shortages start to affect the health, well-being, and quality of life of people, or when the drought starts to affect the supply and demand of an economic product. So to kind of help you determine where you might be in a drought, you may want to look at your local weather and climate data. You can get some stuff from the NRCS snow survey pages, National Weather Service. I look at the Drought Monitor every week, and I'm always hoping. I'm kind of an optimist like Mark. I want to see the dark red go away. I want to see things turn green and blue, but it's starting to wear on me a little bit this year, although it's looking better than it did a couple months ago. So, but you know what? Sometimes an idea might be to set up your own weather station. The rain at my house is about 2 inches short of the rain at the Boise airport. And the temperature is usually a little cooler and the wind's blowing a lot harder. And the rainstorms don't come to my place. But a couple of tools that I find kind of useful is to assess my site and field conditions as we're going through the year when comparing it to my weather impacts. The guide for estimating soil moisture and my soil survey is used a lot to go through the list, see where my soils are, their available water holding capacity and textures. And it can kind of give me a visual description of what my soil moisture percentage is. Because soil moisture is really a key component of grass growth, which when you reduce that soil moisture, you can have some negative effects on above and below ground production, as well as reproductive opportunities and long-term stability of the site. So this was an interesting thing. Mike Smith was one of my professors when I was in school back in the day, and he'd worked on this place for a long time. And we all know that it doesn't take a lot of rain to grow grass, but timing is everything. So they did a 14-year study in a 10 to 14 inch loamy site near Saratoga. And what they found out is that through the correlations and looking at the timing of the precip and the impacts on annual forage production, they concluded that the precipitation that occurs in April is the most important setting for current year's growth. If it does not rain in April, you should probably be sharpening your pencil and looking at plan B or C. And I expect it's a little different here from watching all the stuff I've been seeing. I'm thinking that some of our precip needs to occur in March at this lower country down here in the desert. But this helps clarify how the impacts of soil moisture are important during critical growth periods. If you have adequate soil moisture, new root growth can happen prior to the initiation of that bud and above ground growth to supply the moisture and nutrients needed to develop that grass plant. What about grazing management? You know, Mark talked about it. Sounds like he's got a plan A, B, C, and what did Brenda say yesterday? Double A. Mike talks about how the BLM implements their system when they get a drought. And so the one thing you really want to do is you want to prioritize your goals and objectives. And part of that is to maintain the value and equity of the operation, prevent long-term damage to range health and productivity, and you want to keep the integrity of your herd intact as much as possible. Some short-term objectives should be to maintain plant health and promote healthy root systems and leaf material that can take advantage of the moisture when it comes. Remember that take half, leave half rule, and adjust some of your recovery times a little bit. Long-term objectives, you want to look at maintaining ecosystem and watershed health through your monitoring, adjusting grazing strategies, acquiring maybe some additional forage resources, looking at reducing numbers, and you want to maintain plant residue on the surface to minimize erosion, increase infiltration and water loss when it's available, and create an opportunity to recover at the end of the drought. High grazing demands on drought-stressed plants affects the health, vigor, and productivity of the desired forage species. This leads to invasion of less productive, unpalatable, and maybe even poisonous plants. And addressing damage caused by drought and inadequate management strategies can be time-consuming, difficult, and expensive. Monitor and adaptively manage your operation to meet your desired outcomes. So, keys to drought planning. Set yourself a conservative ranch strategy to insulate yourself and buffer yourself against the drought. As you're looking at your operation, is your carrying capacity or stocking rates set at the dry year level instead of the wet year level? If you set yourself up and stock at a level that is suitable for a good moist wet year when you have a lot of growth, you're going to be more of a pickle when you get to that dry year. Set some resource objectives. What do you want to see? How do you want your grass to grow? How's your erosion? How are your stream banks? Do you need some extra practices to kind of fill in and drought-proof your operation as much as possible? Anticipate a drought. Like the old range con told me when I started, a drought is one rainstorm away. And so where we live in the dry part of the world, droughts are very common. Really long-term intensive droughts, we might be about to see one, but hopefully not. And be early in your decision making. Pay attention. Start looking at things now, start looking at things next year, and figure out how to make those adjustments to maintain your resources and your operation. Be proactive. Monitor your range lands and manage the demand that is occurring on your grasses. And don't forget, all of this you have to be adaptable and flexible. So I want to leave you guys with a quote from Dr. Dijksterhuis, and this one kind of fits right into the world. A man who has a short pasture needs the rain much worse than his neighbor who has ample forage on the range. But when the rain comes, it will do the least good for the fellow who needs it most. And so that kind of sums it up really pretty well. If you start in a good place, you can weather some of these short-term droughts without a whole lot of difficulty and a few minor adjustments. If you start from a bad place, it's only going to get worse. Okay, thanks. I can answer any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. I think that really does sum it up very well there here at the end. And I think we'll hold questions for now, and we'll get to those here after our last two speakers. So our next speaker is Vincent Jansen. He is a postdoctoral fellow in the Forest, Rangeland, and Fire Sciences Department at the University of Idaho. Vincent has a PhD from the University of Idaho and is a member of the Rangeland Center with significant skills in remote sensing and vegetation mapping. He has tackled the challenge of estimating standing forage biomass on rangelands in real time. Vincent has developed models using the Landsat satellite data to estimate vegetation cover in biomass in the Northwest bunchgrass habitat at Zumwalt Prairie Preserve in Northeast Oregon and on rangelands throughout Idaho, including Rock Creek Ranch. So Vincent, I'll let you take over and have your discussion on online climate and vegetation tools for resilient rangelands.
All right, well, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Vincent. I work at the University of Idaho, and I put this presentation together with the help of Catherine Hegowich, who's works at the University of California, Merced. And the aim of this presentation really is to shine some light on information and web pages that currently exist, which you all can access and use to understand more about the climate, weather, and vegetation across the places you work or reside. So in the last few decades, there's really been a rapid growth in the number of online resources and web pages, as well as tools that provide information related to measuring and monitoring drought, weather and climate, and even rangeland vegetation. And with every one of these tools, there are strengths and weaknesses depending on your specific questions or needs. So finding the right tool for your needs can sometimes be difficult. But that said, it's increasingly likely that a data set or tool currently exists which can help answer some of the questions you're interested in. So today I'm just going to highlight 3 existing web pages or platforms that provide tools in more detail. These are the Drought Monitor, the Climate Toolbox, and the Rangeland Analysis Platform. So some things to think about with each data set and tool is that these data sets provided by the tools are based on models which generate the information displayed. And with any model or data set, there can be errors associated with them or uncertainty in the estimates. But that said, just because there's some uncertainty or error, it doesn't necessarily mean that the data or tool is completely unhelpful. So some of the questions we need to be asking ourselves is, what decisions do these tools really help us make? And then what decisions or questions are they not that helpful with at the current time or the current moment? And so depending on your question or questions, the same data might be really helpful in one instance, but not what you need in another instance. It's also important to note that the data provided by these tools need to be used alongside other information that you're seeing on the ground. And the next presenter, Mike Hale, will provide kind of an example and examples of how he's doing that with some of these online tools as well as monitoring in the field. So now getting into the Drought Monitor and tools that may help with resilient rangeland management. The first tool is the Drought Monitor, and you can find this tool at droughtmonitor.unl.edu. And recently, the Drought Monitor has added some more visualization tools for end users. So some things to think about and know about the Drought Monitor is that it's just one instance of drought. It's a single classification of drought based on expert views. And it's used to help decide which counties qualify for forage assistance through the Livestock Forage Disaster Program. And it's really well supported and visible across agencies and the public. You know, some of the other presenters are already talking about the Drought Monitor and maps from it. So looking at some of the tools that are provided by the Drought Monitor, we can easily make maps of the state of Idaho and compare drought at different points of time. So here I'm showing June 2nd of this year compared to September 14th of this year. And you can see the drought really worsened across the state in the last few months. We can also plot drought measures over time by county. So here I'm showing the Drought Monitor data from 2000 to present in Blaine County, Idaho. And as you can see, Blaine County really experienced some exceptional drought back in 2004. And then again, we're getting into exceptional drought in the last year, 2001. The Drought Monitor also provides outlooks about how they think drought will change in the coming months. And this is what another presenter alluded to. And their projections through the end of the year, we can see that brown drought is likely to persist across southern Idaho, but it does look like it may improve in northern Idaho and much of Oregon and Washington. So it's, again, important to think about this is just one instance of drought delineated by a group of experts. But we also know that there's different types of drought, and Brendan just alluded to these. You know, a drought is really the lack of water for a given purpose, and drought can be classified in different ways to align more closely for different stakeholders. For example, some different types of drought are meteorological, agriculture drought, hydrological drought, and ecological drought. And so oftentimes you might want to know more about these specific types of drought in your area. And we can do that with new tools. So the Climate Toolbox provides us a way of doing this. So in the Climate Toolbox, there are 20 different tools to help analyze drought and other data related to climate and hydrology data. They display both historical and future projections of climate data, and you can find these tools at climatetoolbox.org. So let's dive into a few of these tools now to understand these different types of droughts in your backyard. So one such tool that may be helpful to a variety of management needs or stakeholders as well as ranchers is this historical water watcher tool. With this tool, you can select different data sets aligned to different types of drought at your specific location. So here I've selected a spot on Rock Creek Ranch in Blaine County, Idaho. The Drought Monitor data is presented in this tool as well. So you can see this on the right side of your screen, and we're seeing exceptional drought on that piece of property. But exploring the other types of drought indicators for the area, we can further develop our understanding of the conditions on the ground. So moving clockwise around these four figures, here I've plotted precipitation since October 1st, 2020. So this is really the current water year or last year's water year. And this is showing severe drought at this location. Next, I've plotted soil moisture here. And we can see that blue band in the Snake River Plain where probably a lot of irrigation is happening, but then these drier conditions both north and south of the Snake River Plain. We can also plot stream flow data on this map, and this could be really important for water resources across a ranch or an allotment. And lastly, I've plotted the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which shows extreme drought for our selected location. So this is a really neat tool. All in all, you can plot a lot of different types of drought indicators and climate data all in one place and kind of compare them to help you understand the severity of drought you're seeing across a landscape, or in turn, how much moisture you're getting to. Another really helpful tool, hopefully for people out there, is this historical seasonal progression tool. You can plot climate data variables across the current year. Here I'm showing rainfall in red of the current year 2021 in Moscow, Idaho, compared to the climatological median, or what we normally receive in Moscow, Idaho. With this tool, you can also plot past year's data. So this is 2020 data in green now compared to our data in 2020. This tool also allows you to show 30-day weather forecasts for your area, as well as 30-day weather forecasts, and then these 7-month climate forecasts. So hopefully it can help give you some understanding of maybe what you can expect in the coming months. So currently we also have now the ability to go from tools specific to climate data that are aimed at providing from tools that are specific for climate data to tools that also help understand vegetation across your ranch or your pastures. So one such tool that does this is the Rangeland Analysis Platform, and this platform can be found at rangelands.app. This platform provides multiple tools and data sets to estimate cover by major functional group or bare ground, also biomass production data annually or at 16-day intervals. Data within that wrap is currently offered across the West, which is really nice. And recently, they've also developed a set of tools to help with stocking rates. So taking those production measures and translating them into stocking rates annually. So diving into more about what this platform can allow you to do, you can load a shapefile or a boundary of your ranch. Here I'm showing Rock Creek Ranch, again in southern Idaho. You can also draw polygons on the map. You don't need to load specific files of your ranch or allotment. But here I choose a pasture on Rock Creek Ranch, and I could show the percent cover of different cover indicators from 1984 to 2020 for that pasture, and see how those change over time. We can also get annual biomass production estimates for that same pasture. So these are aggregated to the pasture scale, and see how that has changed over time. And then you can also get 16-day production estimates for the current year as well as past year to see how production is being estimated by this tool for your pasture. So a little bit on this recent tool they just created to help with stocking rates. They're calling this the Production Explorer tool. With this tool, they use their biomass production estimates to help understand the variability in production from year to year, and then how that translates into stocking rate calculations using some inputs that the user defines. So with this tool, you have an embedded calculator that users can adjust different variables for their operation and home ranch to get an estimated stocking rate by area or by pasture. So here's like the outputs. And I think this tool really does well to illustrate that impact of drought or climate, that variability of rainfall as well as temperature in production, with how that translates to stocking decisions and how these management decisions are linked to vegetation amounts. So hopefully these three tools I provide that I'm showing today provide a little bit more background and are helpful to you. Also, as noted, there are many more tools that might be of interest, and I'll end with a list. People are also constantly creating new tools as well. For example, here at the University of Idaho, researchers are just getting started on a project to better understand how drought and predators interact to affect food webs across rangeland systems. And one goal with this project is to provide decision makers ecological forecasting tools to help map the probability of interactions between predator and prey across the year. So if you're interested in learning more about this tool or participating in the project, please reach out to Nick Bergman. You can email him at nbergman@uidaho.edu right here. So lastly, this is really the last slide. There are a lot more resources out there on the web to help provide more information on drought. So one of these resources is the National Integrated Drought Information System, NIDIS, for the Pacific Northwest. They do webinars, so you can keep up with drought, and you can sign up for their listserv and you'll get emails about their webinars. And then here's another list of other platforms that might be helpful. So each one of these platforms has tools in them to look at drought or vegetation and climate data. And I'll try to make these slides available up at the Rangeland Center webpage soon, so you can easily access this list and links to these tools. And that's all I have, so thank you.
Oh, great, Vincent. That was a lot of really good information. And I think the big part is it's not just one tool, but how you use them together to gather the information you need. So I thought that was great. We'll hold questions to the end so we can have our final speaker speak with us. So our last speaker today is Michael Hale. In 1981, Michael Hale settled in a remote cow camp in the Imnaha Canyon with his wife and young children. After a decade working for ranches in the Hells Canyon and Zumwalt Prairie areas, Mike returned to college to complete a BS degree in rangeland resources from Oregon State University and a MS in rangeland ecology from the University of Idaho. This course of study provided answers to some of the many questions he had regarding livestock production systems in remote Western landscapes. Today, Michael and his family, with grown children and grandchildren, continue to spend time together on their small ranch along the Imnaha River, raising longhorn cattle, marketing grass-fed beef. Mike has worked as a rangeland consultant across the Western US and several countries in Central Asia, and currently works as a research specialist with the Nature Conservancy on the Zumwalt Prairie in Oregon. So Mike, I will let you take it away.
Thank you for all the organizers of the Rangeland Fall Forum and inviting me to be a panelist. The disadvantage, or maybe the advantage of being last, is seeing all the great information and presentations and thinking of everything that I should have had in my presentation. But I'm going to share my screen. And start the PowerPoint.
Yep, we can see the slides if you want to put it in presenter mode, maybe.
Yeah. There is a toolbar at the above. Okay. That is blocking my, here we go. Got it.
Yep, there you go.
Looks good.
That's good.
So my interest in range management started many years ago. I think in the age of big data and data sharing on some of these platforms reminds me of the interest to keep things local and on the ground. And my life in working in remote cow camps and working with indigenous people in Asia has really kind of fortified my interest in traditional management and how that fits into the technological world. In some of my meetings with the Nature Conservancy, they term or use the term of novel systems for actual traditional systems. So if you're a herder and you're herding cattle daily and trying to even out distribution and looking at resource use and animal health, that's considered to be novel. I would say, well, that's very traditional. And thanks for the introduction. Also, kind of the story of my life where I was immersed at a pretty young age in a traditional transhumance pastoral ranching system in Northeast Oregon. And one of my early teachers in range management had some interesting lessons in kind of in the cowboy vernacular. These things have stuck with me, and you can interpret them however you want. We can discuss what they actually mean, but like, don't let the cattle get the bulge on you, which means just manage to avert disaster. If a cow is licking herself, she's healthy. We were riding across a big grazing allotment pasture on Forest Service lands, and he looked out at the grass and the cattle, and he said, the cows have got to get out of the pasture. It's time to move. And I questioned him about that because there's a lot of forage left. And he said, you have to manage for surplus. My slides aren't advancing. Okay, there we go. So the art and science of rangeland management. When I went back to school, my wife prompted me to take classes at Eastern Oregon University in the OSU program. And I think what attracted me to the program was the use of the art and science of rangeland management, because I grew up being an artist and I observed the life around me and drew pictures. And when I was working on ranches, I'd take a sketchbook and sketch the landscape and the life around me. When I went back to school, I started learning the tools of the trade, clipping biomass plots, collecting data on condition and trend plots, looking at species composition. And then when we started raising longhorn cattle, I was interested in testing the perception that they really do have a different grazing behavior than British cattle. And we did test that in an interesting project with Doug Johnson at Oregon State University. And we found that the Spanish cattle grazed or traveled from water twice the distance in a given day. They watered half as much, and they traveled overall in a pasture twice the distance compared to British cattle. And one of the reasons that we decided to use Spanish cattle on our own production ranch was after my work with Karen and using sheep and a lot of operant conditioning to train them to graze spotted knapweed. If I could have had sheep in the canyon, I would have, but because of bighorn issues, management issues, I wanted the smallest frame hardy cattle I could find. And I started out with Corriente and kind of graduated up to more of a Texas Longhorn cow that we provide little inputs in their management, and they provide us pretty good quality products and an interesting relationship with the animal. The other opportunities I've had to work overseas, in Mongolia was to go and collect data on these vast transects, collecting condition and trend data that go into the Gobi, that went into the Gobi forage program, and livestock early warning system model that uses the FIGRO model that Jerry Stuth developed down at Texas A&M, and we're actually testing it, a similar local model in Wallowa County. But then to be able to spend time with the herder households that are still semi-pastoral, they can move from pasture to pasture, and they oftentimes are faced with very extreme weather conditions, including summer drought and winter zoods. And they really invest a lot in their social capital because they can move from one range to the next. And if they have to borrow a traditional range from another herder group, they have that kind of relationship where people tend to not compete as much for the resources. In my work in Kyrgyzstan, we've developed some pasture and livestock management guides that really use their local ancestral knowledge. And they really depend a lot on evaluating pastures by animal behavior. And I think that's very important because oftentimes, like in ecology and range science, on the plant side, the animal side is often neglected. So in 2017, I started working with the Nature Conservancy as a rangeland specialist. And it was an easy choice to work with the Nature Conservancy on this piece of land because I had worked on it for off and on for 10 to 15 years under like 6 different ownerships. So I knew the landscape. I knew I had a good relationship with the staff. I had worked on a contract basis, collecting data seasonally for them. It is 33,000 acres. We manage for livestock and wildlife, there's up to several thousand elk that we share the prairie and canyons with. The preserve also has a hunt program that has fee hunting and tag hunting that benefits local organizations. As you know, we use that as a fundraiser. And we currently have 5 grazing lessees under full and self-care from April to November. It's really important for me to understand site potential, and I have an interest in ecological site descriptions. I spent 3 seasons mapping the Jordan resource area on BLM lands in Southeast Oregon. And we made this map of the preserve using the soil data, soil map units, and the correlated ecological sites. So we have 16 dominant ecological sites, and we manage for the potential natural community. I threw this question in there because we work with stakeholders and conservation easements that have a real commitment to stewardship, but they also have a different objective of improving ecological potential or feeling that they can improve it with external inputs and different livestock grazing schemes. So it's a question that we are constantly testing ourselves about. One of the really great tools that helps me with building grazing schedules and setting stocking rates is the RangeSat tool that Vincent developed on the ZPP. And there's several tools within this platform that we use to inform our decision making. And one of them Ones I use primarily is the biomass estimates, including accessible acres for setting stocking rates. And I enter those into lookup tables on a Excel spreadsheet we use as our grazing database. And I can put in different stocking rates, different herd structure to build a grazing schedule and see if it's meeting what our stocking rate objectives are. Our goal is to maintain low to moderate stocking rates, which correlate to 20 to 40% utilization. And for the next year grazing schedule, I use end of season biomass for setting the stocking rates, because that's basically what we have to come back to in the next year. So some of the monitoring indicators we use annual riparian vegetation height and some other assessment indicators, but we manage for maintaining a 6-inch stubble height in all the riparian areas that are measured. And then for utilization, we use the landscape appearance, which has 7 different utilization classes. And then there's a couple other, but we'll walk through those. So when I'm measuring utilization, I like to adopt a cow's perspective and kind of using like an optimal foraging theory concept, where a cow is going to get the best bite of nutrition at the least metabolic requirement. And so when I'm walking a step transect, that is the area I'm looking for to estimate utilization, which includes the concept, but that includes the the amount that is wasted through urination, defecation, and trampling. Some of the concepts that we call harvesting efficiency. So each pasture has at least one key area. Oftentimes there's 2, and we track that annually. And once I evaluate utilization in a given year, that also goes into inform the next year's grazing schedule. So some of the kind of scatter around this regression line of stocking rate to percent utilization, we're testing that, that might be a relationship to where the key area is that I'm measuring, and is it really representative of the animal distribution, their use of the resources within a pasture. And to test that, we've in 2019 and 2020, we had 150 GPS collared cattle that went into the experimental paddocks to really look at their animal distribution, and then see with real intensive utilization measures throughout those paddocks to see how distribution relates to the utilization.
So Michael, I don't want to cut you short, but we are running out of time here. So
I'm almost done.
Okay, great.
So the other one we use is the Grazing Response Index, which is really important, interesting exercise to use for planning schedules by reviewing the previous year grazing season scores and adjusting the next year to draft a schedule to meet management objectives. We map those annually. This is a future tool we're using, which is the Wallowa County Livestock Early Warning System forecast. So you can see it's November 3rd. Doesn't look good. We're testing this into the future and see if this can be a useful tool for us. So managing to mitigate risk in a chaotic world. I like to test the technology with how it impacts me and my relationship to the land, and question whether it's keeping us away from the land, or are we using it to test our assumptions but still maintaining those those feet and hoofs on the land that we care for. And I just want to end with a couple quotes. Always maintain a generous margin of surplus between the fertility of the land and our demand upon it. And wherever I look, I want to see more than I need and have more than I use. So I think, and this year also, I just wanted to say that given this extreme year on the preserve with our management strategies, we were able to take on a couple additional lessees because we had surplus grass and they had no grass. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Michael. So for those of you that are still on, we are at the end of our time, but if you want to stay connected, I think we'll take some time for some questions. And I think Karen also has a few remarks she wants to share with us. So I just want to thank all of our panel speakers for providing their, their input and what they've been doing over this year of drought to try and mitigate, being able to keep cows out and have range and resources that are still, usable. And hopefully in the next year, we can continue that as well. So I will send it over to Karen to close this out, and then we'll ask some questions at the end.
Great, Carmen. Thank you so much for doing a great job with this panel. This was an incredible panel. I learned a ton. Thanks for really personalizing it and letting us know what's up. Mark, I think you get the last word with this next year people. I think that we are always just thinking about next year. I'll say my dad maybe topped that. He'd done that so long. He had a saying over his shop that said, "I've done so much with so little for so long that now I can do anything with nothing." So that is essentially what we were asking you to do. What can you do? Can you do anything with nothing? But maybe, I think take-home messages, our realism is going to have to strong arm some of our optimism, and we're going to have to do it together and keep in touch. We got more than the Farmer's Almanac. Thanks to Vincent for showing us that we don't just have one tool, that we have some ways to move forward, not just each other, but some tools. Okay, now I know that you guys want a record of all this, so I just want you to know that we will have all of these presentations crooned down and put on the Rangeland Center webpage as soon as possible. I'm also going to ask all these speakers for some notes and some resources that will be posted for you. So those will come available pretty soon. We'll send a note. I'll ask Eric to send a note out to all of you, as he's been the one that's been communicating. So if you're still on, sure would love to continue to chat and ask some questions. And if you're not, as I kind of come to the end here, I want to thank everybody, and especially thank Crystal and Eric, who've done all the work behind us. And I thank the McClure Center and the Rangeland Conservation Partnership for joining us. So Carmen, if you want to kind of jump back on here, there were some really good questions that came out. Carmen, are you there? There you are. Yeah.
Yep, I'm right here. Yeah, so this is a question that came in for all of our panelists. I thought it was a very good question. So I'll ask the question, and then if the panelists just want to kind of take turns giving us a few words of wisdom or their opinions, that'd be great. So the question was, what are your opinions on how federal agencies should approach permittees on management changes during drought? I agree communication is key, but keeping those good relationships is also so important to me. So I'll just let whoever wants to go first.
Mike, you might start that one off. I know you have thoughts on that.
Sure. I think whoever asked the question nailed it. We need to keep a good relationship, but we also need to be honest. As a federal employee, I have other concerns too that I have to look out for than just the permittee, and I need to be communicating those to make sure they understand, and they need to make sure I understand what we're talking about or looking at from their point of view. There's almost always an answer somewhere in the middle that we can get to.
Rob Mickelson put in the chat earlier that Forest Service is starting to use variable permits, and I think that is part of the key to this. Can we go into an area And can we plant it to where we know that there's moisture there and there'll be regrowth if we give it some time? Can we take an initial graze off of it? Some of the work that was done by Lee Mansky in North Dakota, talking about plants tillering rather than reproducing by seed. Can we take 25% initially, change the chemical makeup of that plant and encourage it to come back or to multiply by tillering rather than staying there for the duration? And his claim was that you could increase your production. You could go to 150% production because you not only change the chemical tendency of that plant from seed to tiller, you also left some material there to photosynthesize and regrow. So I think variable permits are the key.
Yes, I think that that's a common theme when it comes to that, working together, the communication is key with those things. I did have one other question, and this is kind of for, well, most of you probably could have an answer to this, but it was more for Lisa and Brendan. And you both addressed roots in your discussions, and it seems to be like those are an important indicator of range health and something that we could probably look at. So what might you be looking at as an indicator of positive or negative root and plant health?
I can kind of start with that one. So when I'm looking at plant health and vigor overall, what I see above ground is pretty indicative of what I see below ground. A lot of times I may go out there and dig some things up and take a look at them. And you can see as plants shrink and grow, the root system goes like this and fluxes all through the year. It really is, we have grasses that are rapidly growing roots in January and February here, that you dig them up and you have white active growth on the roots and there's absolutely nothing above ground. And so if that system gets started, it really helps maintain and promote the initial green growth. And then once the solar panels are up and the leaves are out to 3 to 5 leaf stages, when the plant kind of becomes energy neutral and then things start happening, that rapid growth phase, the roots are already set for that little piece of the season. So they kind of stop, and their primary purpose is gathering nutrients and moisture. And then seed head comes up, reproductive tillers, it drops off, the root shed again, and the plant is conserving moisture and energy through that dry period of the summer. And then in the fall, it will really take off again and start growing roots before the regrowth occurs. And so you got to have some moisture to make that work. So when I'm doing that, a lot of times it's a shovel. And if I start seeing seed heads, I have a pretty good indication that I have a sort of healthy plant. But like Mark said, if I can graze that plant at a certain time, I can remove the reproductive tiller and stimulate possibly a vegetative tiller, which will increase my production overall for the year.
And I'll just add that one thing that I would look out for that would give me an indicator of maybe stressed roots or poor root health would be compacted soil. So then you're getting rid of like air and water spaces for those roots to grow, or active soil erosion where you're seeing some exposed roots. That would, to me, be an indicator of more stressed plants and would be a concern.
Okay, great. Well, I guess that is the last question that I had in my question bank. I guess, Karen, if there's anything else that you wanted to close with us.
You bet. Let me ask one more question and then we'll go out. Thanks again, Carmen. Vincent and Mike, I'm going to leave it to you because you guys haven't answered a question yet. You guys brought some tools to us, and our theme was sort of adaptability and flexibility. And I'm wondering what these electronic tools are going to do for people like Mark on the ground to be more adaptable and flexible and responding to the challenge. So I might throw that to you first, Mike, if you don't mind. Just what are those tools, those things you're using? How do they help you?
Well, they make my life a lot easier when I'm scheduling grazing, because with the Zumwalt Prairie Preserve, it's a very complex pasture system that we've had multiple grazing leases, and we also provide cattle with variable stocking rates for research. So these tools really allow me to adjust and adapt. What I find is most important in practicality is to set the grazing schedule, put it out for review, but also we adapt it all through the year. So I'm constantly adjusting it because of the chaos that is out there with animals not arriving at the right time, and we have on the full care, we do contract with the herder to manage the cattle on the land and provide supplements and get them moved appropriately. I think just having those tools allows for some projection into the future. I think that, the range set, as we continue to use it, we find more things that are very useful in the tool itself. And something that we want to explore more is the use of the relative difference and how it relates to utilization. So for areas that we're not able to get out on the ground and measure utilization, can the relative difference from range set indicate, or what's the relationship to percent utilization? I think I'd really like to see that more. And then using collared cattle and really understanding the distribution within our lessees. We have different continental breeds that have different behavior. We have yearling heifers, steers, and mother cows. So they all have different behavior on the range. Understanding what the mix, how that affects the mix within a herd. And just being on a really heterogeneous landscape, it's just really challenging to have real predictable, that's not the right word, even distribution, but that's okay, because in nature, with free ranging animals, they select resources in different patches anyway. And with some of the research out here, it's okay to have some undergrazed, some perfectly grazed, and some overgrazed patches, as long as the average is still meeting those objectives of low to moderate stocking rates and utilization values.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. It's not just flexibility, but it's the variability on the range. So I've heard talk about these tools kind of helping you sleep at night, also experience, and then Mark, just knowledge, just reading stuff. So those gut wrenching decisions are hard, but those tools maybe help. And then Vincent, I'm going to give you the last word. Lucky you.
Yeah, I think a lot of what Mike said was great. I think for me, the two big things maybe that weren't necessarily touched on is variability over space and time. So these tools provide a large view of the landscape, and also a lot of them go back to the 80s. So to be able to understand that variability of production or of drought back in time to now, and compare that to what people are seeing on the ground, can be really helpful to understand, what may be coming or what is expected. The other big thing I think with these tools, and we touched on with a little bit prior, is that communication with stakeholders or lessees or neighbors. If people are looking at the same source of information, if we can all get around a similar map and talk about it, I think there's a lot of learning that can happen, and we can share information more easily, but also we can get all on the same page about, this is what I'm seeing, this is what you're seeing, this map is showing these things similarly, like I now kind of know where you're coming from. And maybe it also helps to reduce conflict, as well as learning from neighbors in new ways with these tools.
Thank you. What a great way to end. It was absolutely my honor to be here, and you guys just did really open up some ideas, and I have a lot more to think about now. Remember, I started this saying it's time to sit back and reflect and conjure up and ruminate, and now I've got stuff to ruminate on. So thank you all. I want for everybody that stuck with us this whole time that we will do our very best here at the Rangeland Center to answer the questions that were sent in and to get the resources that are out there. And thank you so much. This was a great session. Have a really great afternoon to everybody.